Right, the contrapositive, inverse, and converse will be useful, okay, when we are talking about arguments at a later stage. Okay, so once we are familiar with this, okay, we can actually go on and talk about arguments. Okay, so typical argument is made up of premises. Okay, usually we have more than one. So let's say we have premise 1, premise 2, and a conclusion. Okay, conclusion. So a typical argument is presented to you in a series of premises and one conclusion. Okay, the way to determine validity of argument, there are a few ways. Okay, so first type of argument would be arguments about specific cases. That means we are not talking about general terms, something that is universally true. Okay, so arguments would be, in this case, we do not make use of predicates. That is a later part. Okay, so example of argument would be things like, okay, let's say P implies Q. P didn't happen, and therefore we conclude that Q will not happen. Okay, so this is an example of argument. Okay, how do you determine whether the argument is valid or not? So this whole thing is an argument. Okay, so your job is to decide or determine whether or not it is valid. Okay, so we do not argue with the premise. Okay, you do not have to worry about does P really leads to Q? Okay, if P is true, is Q really going to happen? No, we do not question the premise. Okay, what we want to do is to determine whether or not, okay, this flow of argument follows logically or not. Right? In other words, determine whether the argument is valid or not. Okay, so there are two methods. I'll show you the first method. The first method is to make use of truth table. Okay, so in our case here, okay, we need to produce a column for premise 1, one column for premise 2, and one column for conclusion. Okay, let's do that. Okay, you can see that we have two inputs, P and Q. Okay, so once again, we have 4 rows. So Q will be true, false. P will be 2 true followed by 2 false. Okay, if you have 3 inputs, then it will be 8 rows, and the outermost column will be 4 true followed by 4 false. Okay, so fortunately for us, now we only have 4 rows. Okay, so next you need one column for premise 1, so P implies Q. P implies Q, if you remember, the way to handle this, we look for a specific case which is true, pre-condition true, post-condition false. Okay, something, the front part happened but the back part did not. Okay, making this actually a false promise. So this is a case where it's false. Okay, all other cases will be true. Okay, so we have premise 1, you may want to label it. Okay, premise 1. Okay, then premise 2 is negation of P, so it's quite easy to do. Negation of P. So P is true, true, false, false. So over here it will be false, false, true, true. So premise 2. Okay, you would then have to construct a column for the conclusion. So our conclusion is not Q, this is our conclusion. Okay, negation of Q, so Q is true, false, come to here, it will be false, true. Okay, after that, to determine the validity of argument, okay, you need to identify what is known as the critical rows. Okay, so for critical rows, we will look at the premises. Okay, we do not look at conclusion when finding out critical rows. So what we are looking for will be rows in which all our premises are true. So let's look at row 1. Row 1, this is true, this is false. So this is not a critical row. Row 2, both of them are false, not critical row. Row 3, both of them are true. So this is a critical row, row number 3. And then row number 4, both of them are true, right? Okay, so this is also a critical row. Okay, so row 3 and 4 are critical rows because all premises are true. Okay, So once you identify the critical rows, okay, you will look at the conclusion in those rows. So conclusion will be false and true. Okay, we basically ignore everything else above them, okay, because these are non-critical rows, so we will not inspect the conclusion for those other two rows. Okay, so if the argument is valid, then whenever the premises are all true, the conclusion should also be true. Why? Because this is how the argument is formed, right? We're saying that if premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, then this must be true. That's how argument is presented. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. When this is true and this is true, is this true or not? Okay, so over here we have a case where premise 1 is true, premise 2 is true, but our conclusion is false. Okay, so this actually shows that the argument is invalid. Okay, so write down argument is invalid. Okay, you have to tell people why you say it's invalid. You have to, in a test situation, you have to convince the marker that you're not guessing this, okay? Because it's either valid or invalid, right? So it's invalid. Okay, why? Because row 3, right? Right. So let's say because conclusion is false. In row 3, okay, which is a critical row. Right, so this is the first method in which we can determine validity of argument. Okay, this first method, which is using truth table, is more flexible. Okay, you can handle cases where you have 5 premises and 1 conclusion. Okay, the second method that we're going to cover is on rules of inference. Okay, so rules of inference is quite rigid because there are only 4 forms. Okay, so our argument have to match one of those 4 forms before the rules of inference can be used to determine validity of argument.